So that was basically accepted by all parties and by the tribunal. And so on that basis, we said that the proposal shouldn't go ahead. And we said that we proposed two alternatives. The first was that instead of building this proposal, Victoria should be looking at combined cycle natural gas. We weren't sort of trying, obviously the court is not an appropriate forum to put forward an energy policy that the government should be following, and Environment Victoria probably wouldn't be happy with suggesting anyway that we should all switch to gas immediately because there's environmental concerns with that as well. But we were saying as an alternative this would be an example of an environmentally preferable outcome, and we also said that the other thing that a proper exercise of the precautionary principle in this case would require is doing nothing for now, and that's for two reasons. There was technological uncertainty about, so there was scope for this plant being improved. The one, if you remember before, I mentioned that there's two types of gas plants, one that runs only on natural gas at the moment but is cleaner and more efficient than the one that dual gas is using. The evidence given by engineers and experts was that it was likely in the next 5 to 10 years that that type of gas plant would be able to be used for the gasified coal. So in the context of that, and the other thing that dual gas argued was that if and when carbon capture and storage ever became available and technically feasible, then they would implement it and use it. And at the moment, there's on foot, the government has a couple of kind of research trials that they're about to fund, that they're investigating the feasibility of, that will be located around the Latrobe Valley. And so they also said that dual gas argued that because this is happening, it's likely that the plant will be cleaner and have much less carbon emissions in future, and we said that's really uncertain. No one can say whether CCS will work yet, so on that basis you should do nothing for now until CCS has been shown to be able to be feasible. So that was our precautionary principle argument, and then we also said that the proposal didn't properly integrate environmental, social and economic considerations. And I've already said what the environmental impacts are, so I won't say that again, but economically the argument, became quite a central argument in the case, because when the EPA only approved half of it, one of dual gas's main complaints was, well, that's going to make the whole thing economically unviable. So then the EPA brought evidence from an economics expert who said actually the 600 megawatt and the 300 are both economically unviable, but because the 300 megawatt costs less at the capital stage, like when you're building it, it might actually be more viable. So that was quite an interesting turn of events. And so we had this context where if you're going to balance economic, social and economic environmental, social and economic considerations, in the context of a plant that might not be economically viable, firstly, and secondly, it was only going to provide about 37 jobs, which in the context of the state of Victoria is not that significant. And all the manufacture was going to be done in China and offshore, and they were going to basically bring it all out on a ship and just stick it on the site. So we said economic impacts have to be viewed as economic benefits to the state, not to the particular company, and that also if you weigh up the economic benefits, they don't trade off successfully, they're not significant enough to trade off the cost of the environment. And so those were our arguments on the principles. Then in terms of state and national measures, we argued, well, Victoria now has in place, for now anyway, it's under review, but the Climate Change Act has a target that we reduce our emissions on 2000 levels by 20% by 2020. So there were lots of 20s in that sentence. But basically, that is an obligation of the state government. It's not an obligation on the EPA particularly or the individual developers or anything, but it's something that the government should be trying to achieve through the way that it implements its policies and makes its decisions. And the dual gas proposal alone would take up 13%. Sorry, I think I've forgotten how we did the maths on this one. Yeah, the dual gas proposal as well constitutes 13% of the overall emissions reduction that we are required to make by 2020. So already that proposal alone is quite a significant sort of hurdle in the way of that target being met, so we argued that. And under the Act, the Climate Change Act is something that the EPA had to take into account. Prior to the Climate Change Act being passed, it was Labor government policy when they were in government, but it was also supported in pre-election documents by the Coalition that all new coal-fired power stations have an emissions intensity limit, and that was of 0.8 megatons of carbon equivalent per megawatt hour. and that emissions, that target could only be met by dual gas if they use significant amounts of natural gas. So we were arguing that that should be a condition on their approval. And then there was that has never been legislated or regulated, so there was also questions about the weight that should be given to that particular emissions intensity limit. And then finally we argued about best practice. So that's the definition of best practice. So it means the best combination of eco-efficient techniques, methods, processes or technology used in an industry sector or activity that demonstrably minimises the environmental impact of a generator of emissions in that industry or activity. We said that you don't have to define the whole scope of industry sector or activity, but it should be at least as broad as, well, we said it should be, as a starting point, it should be electricity generation because you focus on the outcome, and the outcome is electricity. It doesn't matter if it's from wind or from coal. The benefit to the consumer and the end product is electricity. But even if you don't accept that, you don't have to... Okay, I wasn't sure whether you were saying hurry up. So we were saying you don't have to define the outer limits of that, but at the very least we should be comparing it with other fossil fuels, and in particular we should be comparing it with natural gas. And the reason we said that is, I mean, as I showed on that diagram before, it's a natural gas plant. It's just using a particular type of gas, which happens to be substantially, I think, about twice as inefficient as natural gas. So we were saying, even if you don't agree that you have to compare it with wind and with other renewables, which was our first proposition, you should still find that it needs to be compared with natural gas. The EPA argued that it should be compared with brown coal, so they were basically saying you're using brown coal as a fuel, so you compare it to the likes of Loy Yang and Hazelwood, and if you do that, it's obviously significantly cleaner. And dual gas argued that it's unique, so you only need to compare it against itself. And because nothing in the world exists quite like this, then this is best practice, which is quite nifty. So that was, I think, as I said before, I think who is successful will fundamentally hinge on how the tribunal chooses to interpret that provision. But the other critical issues in the case that were argued was one, whether it's economically viable. As I said, the evidence was that it might not be economically viable. One scary thing that the evidence also said was even if it's not economically viable, power stations frequently get built even if they're not economically viable. That company then starts losing money. This is what's happened several times in Victoria, and Hazelwood's an example of this. Then they get sold cheaply, and then the company who buys them cheaply then operates them and then does make money, and it does become viable. So it's kind of not something that's thought about at the beginning. And then once you've built a power station, if you're going to make any money, you've got to keep operating it. So again, Hazelwood's an example of this. So the only way you can get that money back on that investment is to keep operating, even if overall it's not necessarily, you're not getting all your capital costs back or anything. As long as you're sort of covering your fuel costs, there's a tendency in the market for those power stations to keep operating. So that principle was significant both in terms of the viability of whether dual gas would go ahead or not, and it was also significant as one of the main arguments put forward by dual gas was that in the context of a carbon price about to come into force, it was likely that the dual gas proposal would displace some of Hazelwood and Loy Yang and the more inefficient operators in the Latrobe Valley, and that's what they were actively seeking to do. But the evidence was that Hazelwood is probably not going to shut down unless it's required to shut down by the Contracts for Closure program, which I'll talk about in a second. Because if it does shut down, that's it. Nobody makes any income. While ever it keeps operating and keeps selling power, it can keep making some sort of income. So dual gas said, yeah, that they would try and displace Hazelwood. The evidence was that that would be unlikely to happen. Dual gas also argued that the Contracts for Closure is a part of the government's clean energy package, and they're basically committed, I think, to buying, I think it's 2,000 megawatts of power by 2020 from the dirtiest operators. So they're Hazelwood and Loy Yang are included in that. Another power station in South Australia is included. There's some likely candidates. Energy Bricks, a little power station in the Latrobe Valley that's run by HRL as well, is also a likely candidate for that program. But we don't know. Those contracts haven't been finalised. We don't know what power and on what terms and what timeline the government will be buying those, and we don't definitely know if it'll go ahead. We could have an election and that contract and all those and the clean energy packages could be withdrawn. So there's a fair bit of uncertainty about whether those contracts for closure will actually go ahead anyway. So one of the fundamental arguments was whether, because dual gas were trying to argue that it would displace stuff and then it would have an overall positive environmental outcome. So there was an argument about whether that would actually occur. There was also argument about the extent to which the Climate Change Act was relevant in the context of making the decision. As I said, the onus, or the person who's responsible for meeting that 5% target is the Minister for the Environment. It's not the EPA, it's not individual operators. So they were sort of saying, you know, it's how that 5% target is met is up to government. It's not the role of VCAT to be making decisions on an individual level about that target. So they were the main arguments, and so we'll find out maybe I expect in the next sort of 2 to 4 weeks, because VCAT did give an indication about when they'll make their decision, and we'll find out who's successful ultimately. I might just quickly close on the implications of the case. So basically, if we're successful and we can argue that the industry sector or activity should be defined at least as widely as comparing it with natural gas, that will pretty much mean that unless the regulations are changed, there won't be any brown coal approved in Victoria again, because it won't be able to be approved under the current regulations, because it won't be able to show its best practice in terms of managing its emissions. So we think that's quite a significant outcome, and it's one of the reasons why we were interested in taking the case on and why we put significant resources into it up front, because I think hopefully if we win, it'll have a pretty, it'll have broad implications. If we don't win, it will also have broad implications. But this provision in the law has never been tested before, so it'll be interesting to see what happens.